I woke up to find a homeowner association official's car parked right in the middle of my farm without my consent. I don't even live in a homeowner association. When polite requests didn't work, I decided to handle things my way. Let's just say, when they came back, their car was nowhere to be found, at least not until they noticed it. Jake stepped out onto his porch, coffee steaming in his mug as he took in the crisp morning air. The golden field stretched out before him, a peaceful sight that never failed to impress. But today, something was different. Right there, parked in the middle of his property, was a gleaming jet black SUV. It stuck out like a sore thumb against the dirt and grass, its polished chrome reflecting the rising sun. He frowned, setting his mug down on the railing. It wasn't one of his trucks. His workers wouldn't leave a vehicle like that in such a careless spot. It was blocking the entrance to one of his barns, and more importantly, standing in the way of where he needed to drive his tractor later that morning. Maybe someone got lost. It happens sometimes. City folks who thought the back roads led to some scenic overlook, only to realize they had driven straight onto private land. Jake walked closer, boots crunching over the dirt. He peered through the tinted windows. No one inside. The engine was off, but it had definitely been driven there recently. The dust on the tires hadn't settled yet. He checked for a note, maybe something explaining the situation. Nothing, he sighed, running a hand over his rough jaw. He wasn't the kind to jump to conclusions. Maybe the driver had wandered off looking for help, or had car trouble and would be back any second. So he waited and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. His patience dwindled. By midday, he had things to do, and this dim SUV was still sitting there, an unwelcome barrier on his land. He tried to push it from his mind, focusing on feeding the animals and prepping equipment for the afternoon work. But every time he passed by, his frustration grew. Where the hell was the owner? By now, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. No one had even bothered to ask for permission to leave their car there. No courtesy, no regard. Jake grabbed his phone and took a picture. He was done waiting. It was time to get some answers. Jake wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. By mid-afternoon, with the SUV still sitting there like a monument to entitlement, he decided to dig a little deeper. He drove into town, stopping by the feed store first. If anyone knew what was going on, it was the folks who had lived here their whole lives. Anyone know who drives a black Escalade with plates from out of state? He asked casually while loading a sack of grain onto his truck. An older man, Clyde, who had been running the store since before Jake was born, gave a dry chuckle. Bet you that's one of them homeowner association types. Heard they've been acting like they own half the town lately. Jake frowned. Homeowner association? What homeowner association? Clyde wiped his hands on his apron. That new one over at Willow Creek. Started with just a few streets, but now they're trying to push their rules on folks who ain't even part of it. Been hearing all kinds of complaints. That didn't sit right with Jake. He thanked Clyde, then made a few more stops, asking around. Everyone had had the same story. The homeowner association had been getting bold, telling homeowners what color they could paint their barns, trying to regulate things they had no business sticking their noses into. By the time Jake got a name, he was already furious. Linda Monroe, homeowner association president. A woman with a reputation for being, in polite terms, a real headache. It didn't take much effort to track her down. She was at a fancy little cafe on the newer side of town, sipping iced coffee with two well-dressed women. They had the unmistakable attitude of people who thought the world revolved around them. Jake walked right up to their table, planting himself firmly in front of them. Linda Monroe. She glanced up, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Yes? Jake pulled out his phone and held up the picture of the SUV. That your car? Linda barely looked at the screen before scoffing. Oh, that? Yes. My assistant parked it there this morning. Is there a concern? Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. Yeah, there's a problem. It's on my property. Linda gave a dismissive wave. Oh, we figured no one would mind. It's just a farm, after all. Jake felt his jaw tighten a bit. Linda sipped her drink. Well, I'll have someone move it eventually. Just work around it now. Jake took a slow breath, keeping his rage in check. Move it now. She let out a laugh, a condescending little chuckle, and turned back to her friends. Honestly, some people get so worked up over the smallest matters. Jake didn't say another word. He just stared at her, expression blank. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said simply, then turned and walked out. Linda had no idea what she had just done, but she was about to find out. The next morning, Jake stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, expecting to see that damn SUV finally gone. Instead, he nearly dropped his mug sitting right next to the first car was another one, a second luxury SUV, parked just as arrogantly like his farm had turned into their personal parking lot overnight. Jake's grip tightened around the handle of his coffee cup. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. His patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. He stomped back inside, grabbed his phone, and called a number he had found for the Willow Creek Homeowner Association. It rang twice before a sharp, familiar voice answered. "Willow Creek Homeowner Association. This is Linda." Jake growled, his voice sharp. "I gave you all a chance to move your car, and now, there's another one sitting on my land. I want them gone now." Linda sighed as if he were inconveniencing her. "Oh, that must be one of our board members. He probably just parked there for a little bit. We'll get to it when we get to it." Jake clenched his jaw. "No, you'll get to it now. You're being ridiculous," Linda said, exasperated. "Just be patient. Maybe go attend to your little crops or whatever you do all day." Jake took a slow breath, his free hand curling into a tight fist. "Linda, I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand just fine," she interrupted. "I understand that people like you farm. Rural folk don't get how things work when proper homeowners associations come into play. We have rules to maintain. I suggest you cooperate instead of making this a dispute." Jake had heard enough. Without another word, he hung up. He wasn't wasting any more time arguing. He tried calling the local authorities next, hoping to get some kind of legal backup. But the moment he mentioned the homeowner association, the responses became hesitant. "Well, sir, if they're not technically trespassing inside a fenced-off area, it's a complicated issue. The homeowner association has been working closely with city officials on some zoning issues, so we'd recommend a diplomatic approach. The best thing to do would be to file a complaint and wait for negotiation." Jake exhaled slowly, eating his forehead. Mediation. Waiting. Filing complaints. He knew what that meant. It meant nothing was going to happen. The homeowner association had power in town. People didn't want to step on their toes. That was fine, because Jake wasn't waiting. He slipped his phone into his pocket and strode toward the barn. The morning sun was warm on his back, but all he could feel was a slow-burning rage settling deep in his gut. If the homeowner association thought they could treat his land like a free parking lot, then it was time to show them just how big a blunder they had made. Jake was a man of many words, but when he sent a warning, people damn well received it loud and clear. He climbed into his farm loader, the familiar rumble of the engine vibrating beneath him as he shifted into gear. Outside the two homeowner association SUV sat gleaming in the morning sun, their polished surfaces looking painfully out of place against the dirt and dust of his land. They didn't belong here, and he was about to make sure they'd never come again. Jake drove toward the back of his property. Of bucket, he scooped up an enormous heap of the foul-smelling mess, the weight of it making the hydraulic strain slightly. He took a deep breath, then maneuvered the loader back toward the SUVs, carefully checking to make sure no one was around. The coast was empty. He positioned himself at just the right angle, his grin widening as he imagined Linda's horror. Then, with the perfectly timed pull of the lever, splash, the first SUV disappeared under a tidal wave of manure. The wet, heavy mess, spattering across the windows, clogging the air vents, and dripping over the roof like some kind of glorious farm-fresh landslide. Jake let out a satisfied chuckle. He wasn't done yet. Lifting the bucket again, he grabbed another massive scoop and dumped it onto the second SUV, ensuring that both vehicles were buried up to their door handles in the thick, stinking pile. By the time he was finished, there was no way anyone was getting inside without wading through waist-deep manure, even touching The door handles would be an ordeal. To add the finishing touch, Jake hopped down, grabbed a piece of plywood, and scrawled a message in bold black paint. "Next time, ask first." He planted the sign right on top of the steaming heap and stepped back, hands on his hips. It was perfect. Satisfied, he dusted off his jeans, climbed back into his loader and drove off, whistling to himself. Now, all that was left to do was wait. And judging by the sheer amount of manure he had just dumped on those cars, it wouldn't take long before the homeowner association came running. Jake didn't have to wait long. About an hour later, he heard the screech of tires on gravel, followed by the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. "What the hell?" Jake strolled out of barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he took in the hilarious sight before him. Linda Monroe stood in front of the now manure-buried SUVs, her designer heels sinking into the dirt as she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. Two other homeowner association board members flanked her, their jaws slack with shock. One of the men gagged as the stench hit him full force. Another took a cautious step back, covering his nose with his sleeve. Linda, however, was in full meltdown mode. She turned toward Jake, her face contorted in rage. You did this." Jake tilted his head, pretending innocence. "Did what?" She flung a manicured hand toward the steaming pile. "You buried our vehicles in." Her voice caught her throat as she gagged, barely holding down whatever overpriced latte she had that morning. Jake shrugged. "Oh, that looks like someone parked in a bad spot." One of the homeowner association board members let out a strangled noise. "You're going to pay for this. We're calling the cops. You can't just destroy property like this." Jake crossed his arms, letting the moment stretch just long enough to make them sweat. Then in a calm, steady voice he said, "Actually, I can. And I have every right to." Linda scoffed. "You think you can get away with this? You're in serious trouble, farmer boy." Jake chuckled. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he tapped the screen a few times before holding it up. "I recorded our conversation, Linda. You admitted that your people parked on my land without permission. That's called illegal entry." Linda's smirk faltered. Jake continued, stepping forward slightly. "Not to mention you refused to move them when I asked. And now," he gestured toward the manure-covered vehicles, "this is just farm waste management. If you don't want your cars covered in manure, don't park on my damn property." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Linda, he's got a valid point." Linda shot him a murderous glare before turning back to Jake. "This isn't over. I'll have my lawyer on the phone in 5 minutes." Jake smirked. "Go ahead, call them. While you're at it, why don't you call the news too?" Linda frowned. "What?" Jake pointed up. "See that?" Her gaze followed, landing on a small drone hovering just above the property, its camera lens gleaming in the morning sunlight. Jake grinned. "Looks like word's getting out across town." A local reporter was already running the story. A farmer fighting back against an out-of-control homeowner association that had been illegally using private land. The footage showed the steaming pile of manure, Linda screeching in front of it, and Jake standing there as calm as ever. Within minutes, comments flooded in online, serving them right. Homeowner association bullies getting a taste of their own medicine. This guy's a legend. By the time Linda's phone started ringing, the damage was already done. Homeowner association members, already sick of her power trips, started turning against her. Homeowners who had quietly endured her nonsense for months began speaking out, sharing their own stories of harassment. Complaints were filed, petitions were signed, and before the sun even set, Linda Monroe had gone from homeowner association queen bee to public villain. Linda Monroe had spent years bullying people into submission. She wasn't used to losing, but this time she had picked the wrong opponent. The fallout was swift and harsh. Within 24 hours, the homeowner association was flooded with complaints from its own members. The story had gone viral, and suddenly, people who had been too afraid to speak up were coming out of the shadows. Homeowners who had been fined for ridiculous violations were now demanding explanations. The local news station ran multiple segments exposing the Homeowner associations overreach and a mayor, sensing public anger, announced an official investigation into their practices. And Linda, she was scrambling. She tried to spin the story, claiming she was a real victim. "That farmer is a threat," she cried. "During a homeowner association meeting, he attacked us. We must take legal action." But no one was listening. Not when Jake had video proof of her trespassing. Not when the homeowner association's own treasurer resigned on live television, citing Linda's embarrassing and reckless leadership, and certainly not when her own board members turned against her to save their own positions. 2 weeks later, the homeowner association sent Jake a formal letter. They offered to cover the entire cost of removing the manure, repairing any damage to his land, and compensating him for undue stress and inconvenience. Total amount $22,000. Jake laughed when he read it. Not because he needed the money. He would have happily shoveled the manure himself, just with satisfaction, but because it meant one thing: they knew they had failed. As for Linda, she lasted another 4 days before stepping down as homeowner association president, publicly blaming ungrateful homeowners for not supporting her. Not that it mattered, her reputation was already in the ruins. Last Jake heard, she was selling her house and moving 3 towns over, where hopefully she'd learned to stay out of other people's affairs. With the homeowner association humbled and the troublemakers gone, Jake's farm finally returned to what had always been: quiet, peaceful, and completely homeowner association free. And if every now and then he passed by the now permanently installed "next time ask first" sign near his property entrance and chuckled to himself, well, who could blame him? A few weeks after the chaos, Jake figured it was all over. The homeowner association had backed off, Linda was discredited, and life had gone back to normal. But people like Linda, they never really change. It was a quiet evening when Jake noticed a car parked near the edge of his property. Not on his land. She wouldn't dare, but close enough that it made his stare. Linda. She was sitting in the driver's seat of a beat-up sedan. Nothing like the fancy SUV she used to flaunt. Jake could see her glaring at his farm from a distance, phone in hand, as if contemplating one last act of petty revenge. And then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a police siren. Jake leaned against his porch railing as 2 patrol cars rolled up behind Linda's vehicle, blocking her in. An officer stepped out, flashlight in hand. "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, "step out of the car." Jake grinned. He had a real good idea of what was happening. Apparently, after all her public embarrassment, Linda had tried filing a harassment complaint against Jake, claiming he threatened her and damaged her belongings. She must have thought showing up near his farm would help her case. Unfortunately for her, the police had already investigated the matter. And you know what they found? The fraudulent homeowner association paperwork she had been using to justify expanding her control beyond its limits. Turns out Linda had been faking homeowner association jurisdiction over properties that were never legally part of it, including Jake's land. The cops had been waiting for an excuse to bring her in, and she had just given them one. Jake watched, arms crossed, as Linda was placed in handcuffs, her protest getting more desperate by the second. "This is a mistake. I'm a community leader. You have no right to do this to me." Jake chuckled. She really couldn't help herself. The officer glanced over at him. "Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Walker. I think this is the last time she'll be bothering you." Jake tipped his hat, appreciative. Officer Linda was shoved into the back of the patrol car, still screeching about how this was all a misunderstanding. But Jake, he just turned and walked back to his porch, whistling a little tune to himself. The next weekend, he used part of the $22,000 homeowner association payout to throw a huge neighborhood gathering. People from all over town showed up, especially folks who had been burned by the homeowner association. Before there was live music, smoked brisket, cold beer, and a whole lot of laughing at Linda's failure. Jake raised a toast as the sun set over his land, to good neighbors, bad homeowner associations, and knowing when to stand your ground. The crowd erupted in cheers, and as he took a sip of his beer, Jake knew one thing for certain: no clipboard-wielding dictator would ever mess with him again.